Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. St. Louis journalist Sarah Kendzior has become something of a media sensation in recent years. Her success is based on her reporting on the tens of thousands of people she reaches through social media and by the success of her 2015 e-book, The View from Flyover Country. It's an insightful series of essays on the American condition. She started writing them in 2013. She's widely credited with predicting Donald Trump's election victory before just about anybody else. An updated View from Flyover Country is now out in print. We recorded an hour-long Maryville Talks Books interview with Sarah before a bookstore audience at Left Bank Books in the Central West End last week. I began by asking how she explains her relatively sudden national celebrity.
Well, it's really unfortunate, actually. I'm looking forward to the time when my expertise is not needed or valued. I started out studying authoritarian states in the former Soviet Union. I looked at things like corruption, propaganda, the manipulation of truth, governments that try to oppress its own citizens. And unfortunately, that expertise became very handy in the 2016 election and the lead up to Donald Trump. And I was able to foresee, a lot of different events, but the main one is basically that, the Constitution is only a piece of paper unless people enforce it. Checks and balances need to actually be upheld. Our system is only as good as the people who are in it, and it turns out that those people aren't very good at all.
Well, what were you saying that reminded you of the authoritarian studies?
In terms of Donald Trump?
Oh, yeah.
Well, in many ways, I don't want to say that this is completely borrowed because we've had demagogues throughout American history. You certainly have racist demagogues. But, at heart, he's a kleptocrat. He's somebody who was running in order to enhance his personal wealth and abuse that executive privilege. And he managed to get into that position to be able to do that by exploiting American pain. And when I saw him, running for election, I knew that a lot of the things he was saying about the economy were going to resonate in a way that I don't think the national media necessarily would pick up on because they had this idea that, the recession had ended, that our problems were solved, that it was smooth sailing. So there's that aspect. I think also, as we know in St. Louis, this is a time of turmoil and strife. In times of financial hardship, you often see xenophobia, you see racism. He tapped into pain and turned it into hate. He's a vulture. He has an instinct. And he was very, very skillful at using the media, which itself is financially hard hit, at achieving that goal. And I'm a member of the media, but I criticize it because, I think it's a powerful tool and we need to hold it accountable. And I was frustrated to see the way they carried out that coverage at the time.
The media seemed to look at that campaign early on, certainly, as entertainment. The cable networks and even the commercial networks were saying, this guy is golden, just put him on the air as much as you can and the ratings will soar.
Yeah, it's absolutely shameful. I mean, there's a sort of exploitative synergy. I think Trump was aware of this vulnerability of the media, of its financial vulnerability, and of its moral apathy. I mean, when you launch your campaign saying that Mexicans are rapists and murderers, and you continue from there to target different groups, to target individuals, and have that treated like a joke, like a game, it's alarming. And I think that we have this tendency in the media in general. I think a certain way Ferguson was framed like that. But, they found their cash cow in Donald Trump, and they did not think of the broader consequences because they didn't think that he could win. And I did think he could win, and that was the difference.
One of the things the media seemed to be doing was not paying attention to, quote, flyover country, where the votes were going to come from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they just didn't understand the level of hardship that people are experiencing. And, I kind of want to distinguish between Trump's base, which I do think is, xenophobic and bigoted. I think that those qualities in Trump are an attraction for them. And people who voted for Trump, people who sort of saw two options and kind of shrugged and were like, I don't like either of them, but I guess I'm going to go with this guy because of what he's promising me. Trump knew what to say. He said lies that felt like truth. When he said, for example, that we had a rate of 40% unemployment, people on the coasts laughed. They said, that's just idiocy. He's going to get called out. That's ridiculous. And I heard that and I thought that is going to resonate because that is how it feels. When you can't pay your bills, when you're underemployed, when your skills aren't being utilized, that's how it feels. But of course, the way this played out in terms of votes is, divided across racial lines. It was white people who were willing to overlook all of the hateful things that he said and vote for him. But everybody, I think, or almost everybody, is feeling some kind of economic pain in this climate.
The media did not have its finger on the pulse of places like Missouri?
Oh, they don't care. I mean, they come in for a tornado or for Ferguson or for an election. Maybe they'll come for Greitens. But they I mean, it's never for anything good, I guess, is kind of my point. And it's really unfortunate because I think that that's not just true of Missouri, but of almost every state, between the coasts that are outside of a major city like Chicago. We now have 1 out of every 4 journalists living in New York, D.C., or L.A. I mean, that was not the case. No, local news has been gutted. And so it's easy for them to resort to stereotypes and to not sort of have a sense of what everyday life is like. Like, you have no idea how many people with this book have asked me about, what's it like to live on a farm? What's it like to live in a rural area? And I'm like, I live in St. Louis. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, I live in a metro of 3 million people. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, they genuinely don't know. And what makes me sad about it is they don't care. They don't have the curiosity. They don't see this as something worthy of their intellectual interest.
You mentioned Greitens, and I don't want to digress too much.
Oh,
but he seemed well, that's the point. He seems to have patterned himself in so many ways after the president, I suppose, having recognized the success the president had.
Yeah, I mean, he launched his whole campaign. This is a guy who was a Democrat and a Rhodes Scholar and all this stuff, with his guns out in the field saying he's an outsider. He's not an outsider anyway. But I think that, what is most striking about him as a person is this feeling of impunity, that he can do all sorts of horrible stuff, and there are children in the audience, so I won't describe all of it. But, personal transgressions as well as, financial misdeeds, absolute corruption. I think corruption is the glue that holds them together, and they feel that they cannot be caught. They feel that there are not consequences. And that's really depressing because I think that, in a sense, they're right. And that comes from the GOP. The Missouri GOP, for once, is kind of better than the national GOP. Mm-hmm. They are trying to hold him accountable. I worry that he'll get away with it in the same way that I worry Trump will.
What is it, do you think, about people who have power, who think that they can get away with so much? And we can go from Harvey Weinstein down to Eric Greitens and certainly many others if we chose to name them.
Yeah, I mean, people, it's a cliche that power corrupts and, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it's true. And I think that we've, over the last few decades had a system where people who are in power have moved further and further away from the ordinary experience of Americans. And I kind of talk about how we got to that point in this book, in which credentialism and kind of buying your way into job, prestige, paying to play, getting an expensive degree, cut people off from the rest of society. So the people who get in are not necessarily of good moral character, not necessarily intelligent, but are connected, and they have that network in. Trump, Greitens, all of them, they like to present themselves as outsiders. These are people with Ivy League degrees. These are people with big business connections. These are people who live lives that most of us can't even fathom. I sure as hell can't. And so, I think that they're out of touch in kind of the worst way, not kind of highbrow and snobby, but down and dirty and, ripping off the American public.
But how does someone like the president get away with it? I mean, there have been so many untruths, to use a softer word, so many things that he has done and said, and he just moves on to the next indiscretion.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I mean, first, I think he's not getting away with it with the American people. We've had more protests this year. We've had record protests in the last couple of years than we ever have. So I do think people are trying to hold him accountable. In terms of the government, it's on the GOP right now to move to impeach. It's on Mueller to indict, prospectively, and he has indicted some people, but, I don't want to freak everyone out, but this is basically a mafia-style kleptocratic operation that has taken over the executive branch, has bullied and threatened the GOP, has bribed members of the GOP, and I think that the GOP maybe accidentally got implicated in this giant international crime scheme that is our White House. Maybe they didn't intend to, but I think as Mueller bears down in this investigation, they're afraid of what people are going to find out about them, and that's why you're seeing this wave of retirements, I think, within the GOP as well.
You mentioned the mafia. You chose a word that Jim Comey is using as he promotes his book. He basically says that was an impression that he had during the Trump administration.
Yeah, and he was clear about that at his hearing last June. He made references to the mafia, which I took as him saying this is a mobbed-up presidency. I think the subtext maybe either flew by people or it's just the kind of thing people don't want to confront. I mean, in a way, we're familiar with the history of fascism, of demagogues, of kind of American-style demagogues. We've had that before. And we are, of course, familiar with, plutocrats and big business. The complicated kind of kleptocratic webs that exist in a country like Russia or countries I studied when I studied the former Soviet Union are so horrifying and so hard to take apart. It's not something that sort of has permeated the American consciousness, but that's what I think we have. We have, oligarchs and plutocrats and a lot of very wealthy and powerful guys trying to make policy so that they can benefit themselves. So things like the Russian sanctions, for example, and it does function like a mafia, and that's a very frightening thing. I don't want to play it down.
You mentioned the protests a few minutes ago. What do you make of what's happening now with Me Too, with the kids from Parkland and with the Black Lives Matter and others who are out there on the streets?
I mean, I think it's great. I encourage people to keep doing it, even if they don't seem to be getting a result. Because part of this, I think, part of what we need to do as citizens is to not accept autocracy. We should expect it. That is what we've been giving, but we should never, ever accept it. And to raise your voice and remember your values and find other people who share your values and build those networks, I think is very, very important to just sort of show that there is this discrepancy between what people want and what their government is giving them.
Do you have the sense that they will? And most of these are young people. They're our future. Do you think we can count on their voting in November?
I think they will. I think if you look at the turnout in states that have special elections, you're seeing really, really high numbers. I think if the elections are free and fair, which is not a guarantee, you will see a Democratic win. One thing I like to say is I'm grateful for those young people, but we as adults should not be putting the pressure on them to lead us because they need to be cared for. They're often traumatized, the kids from Parkland especially. And so I think, we need to take up that mantle too and offer them support, but fight alongside them.
Okay. Moving away from politics for a moment, I have a quote here from an interview that I saw that you had given recently, in which you say, "I love St. Louis, but St. Louis will break your heart." What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's based on living here. I know a lot of people, including myself at times, who've, been in very difficult economic situations. I know a lot of people, basically every friend I have who's Black has been, a target of racial discrimination. I have friends who've been tear gassed. I have friends who've been unlawfully detained. It's a hard place, and then you add to that kind of a lack of opportunity in comparison to more economically thriving places, and it can be tough. But as I said, I do love it. It's the place, where my kids were born, where I'm raising them. When it's your family, you put your heart into your city. You want a better future for them and for others. The other thing is I think because we're in Missouri, because things are cheaper, even if we're all poor, you do have the freedom, I think, to experiment more. You have the freedom to be more unconventional. I think if you're in New York, you're constantly climbing that career ladder, and that encourages conformity. And if you deviate off the path, it might affect you financially. It might, you lose your job, and then you just plummet to the ground. Here, we can kind of have a little more free way of life in that sense intellectually, so it's kind of a mixed bag.
I should explain to the audience at home that a big black cat just walked across in front of us here. You're not superstitious, are you?
I don't know, man. My book is number 666 on Amazon right now, so I think it's all kind of adding up. I was blaming Jared Kushner. I figured he poxed me or something, but, this is all going to get on the radio, isn't it?
Well, I
this
think
is where you at it,
y'all. I think maybe it will. And going back over your book, which I read a couple of years ago and had to refresh my memory for this occasion, and one of the things that is very, very clear to me is that what you wrote in 2013, 2014 holds up and stands up very well today in so many different areas. Are you prescient?
People like to say that. I think more I have a flair for the obvious. I think that, I tell the truth. I'm an honest person. I think that some of the things I say make people uncomfortable. I think they maybe don't want to look at certain things, especially structural problems. I'm kind of sad that my book still holds up. I'd really like it to go out of date. I'd especially like my writings about Trump, that are new to the collection, to go out of date. And I look forward to that time. But I think what it shows is that in the U.S., we have deep structural problems. We have economic inequality. We have systemic racism. We have opportunity hoarding by elites. We have geographical inequality. And those things have not changed. They've become entrenched, and the Trump administration is entrenching them further by stripping away the social safety net and allowing corruption on a scale I think we've never had.
What kind of reaction do you get from your readers abroad?
Well, often I hear that they are experiencing the same thing. That was something I first noticed when I was writing these essays originally for Al Jazeera. Like when I talk about St. Louis and the problems we're experiencing versus, say, San Francisco or New York, I would hear from people living in the middle of Canada talking about Vancouver and Toronto. I would hear from people living in, parts of India and, talking about, Mumbai or something. Like basically a version of this for every country, for the UK. And I thought that was interesting. And I think it's interesting now because you see the same pattern across the world. You see rising right-wing demagoguery. You see more authoritarian states. I think what's happening in Eastern Europe, in particular, in Poland and Hungary, is alarming. In Turkey, and I think that some of it comes out of this incredible frustration people were feeling and a willingness of the absolute worst wealthy people in each country to exploit that pain.
People in other parts of the world, as you have indicated, are moving to the right. It seems to me that once again the president plays a role in this. I mean, countries all over the world now are talking about fake news. Their leaders are. And obviously that's coming from the kinds of debate and dialogue they're hearing here.
I think it is and it isn't. I mean, one thing that struck me about Trump, was how similar he was to Central Asian autocrats, for example, or how similar he was to Putin, not just their personal relationship, but a kind of rhetorical style and a set of values. I wrote an article way back in March 2016, thinking that Trump would win, called Trumpmanbashi, comparing him to Turkmenbashi, who was the former dictator of Turkmenistan. And so this whole fake news, this whole bombardment of propaganda, disinfo, conspiracy theories, lies, to the point where your head is spinning, that's something that's existed in these, former Soviet authoritarian states for a very long time. It's also, I think, kind of Trump's, just the way he acts naturally, so it works really well. But, Russian scholars have been writing about this for a long time, and Russia is a contrived propaganda strategy that has really transformed their political culture. Here, I think Trump is making an Americanized version of this. It's very tabloidy, it's very salacious, and it, feeds that appetite, this sort of plot twists like Sean Hannity being Michael Cohen's third source. It's like we're all living in this absolutely horrendous movie that would be rejected as a script for being too unbelievable, yet here we are. So.
But he knows how to use the media. He knows how to exploit it
and
every way.
And he's smart about it. I mean, everyone's like, Trump's a moron. And on one hand, I'm like, well, okay, yeah. In terms of having a coherent geopolitical strategy, sure. In terms of having an understanding of human emotion, not necessarily of his own, but of others, I think he's very skillful, and I think he's been using the media, manipulating the media for 4 straight decades, and people should not underestimate that ability. That is such an important ability, and in an age of social media, it's an ability that's hard to hold accountable.
We have to take a break. Let's do that now. We're talking with Sarah Kendzior, who's the author of The View from Flyover Country. We'll be back to continue the conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. And welcome back as we continue our conversation with Sarah Kendzior, who is the author of The View from Flyover Country. We're at Left Bank Books, by the way, and have a nice crowd here. Sarah, how does a young lady like yourself decide she wants to get a PhD in authoritarianism?
That's when I was legit a young lady. I don't think I can make that claim anymore. I've always been interested in repressive societies. I've always been interested in injustice. I mean, that sounds a little bit weird, but, as a kid, the kind of books I was attracted to were books like A Wrinkle in Time, where you find a young girl fighting these kind of repressive powers. As a student, I was always very interested in history. And the thing that always bugged me when I would look at, say, Nazi Germany was not so much, how did Hitler exist, but how did people allow this? Where were the people standing up for others? Where are the people preventing that? And so that question of accountability and of moral necessity has haunted me my whole life. And so, to be in the situation we're in now is nightmarish. And I feel, compelled to speak out about it. I felt compelled to speak out about it from the start.
You mentioned Nazi Germany. I'm reluctant in a way to bring this up, but it does come up a lot. And that is, people see what's going on in this country today with regard to immigrants and treatment of the press and, creating a system whereby, or a scenario whereby the press is suspect. And they look back to the 1930s. My own opinion is that's kind of a dangerous thing to do, but it's almost irresistible not to do it.
I think that we need to be looking at all sorts of different authoritarian regimes. I mean, in a sense, I feel like the internet, the invention of the internet, the spread of it, is a breaking point in human history where it makes it harder to look back at previous eras and make a direct comparison because we're dealing with an entire, new kind of transnational relationships, new kind of communications technology. But a lot of the same themes come up, the same policies that Trump wants to put into practice, the same scapegoating of ethnic minorities. And then you look at things like what ICE is doing to, quote unquote, illegal immigrants, or what's happening to DACA, and just stuff like Charlottesville. It's incredibly alarming. And I think that that's one of those things where we need to consistently condemn it, even if it's happening a lot. I mean, that makes it all the more important. You don't just get used to it. You don't just say, oh, it's the Nazis again. You have to really keep an eye on that and not let it grow and not excuse it.
But of course, in order for us to take advantage of it as a society and work against it, we have to know it. We have to know what that was. And there was a poll that came out the other day showing that young Americans today, to a very large number, have no idea what Auschwitz was.
Yeah, I saw that poll. I think it was something like 42%, almost half didn't. Yeah. And that frightens me. I'd like to know the ages of that. I'd like to compare them with...
They refer to them as millennials, which is a huge population.
That's a huge
today.
Population. I'm on the tail end of that population. It makes me wonder what's being taught in school. But, a lot of people after the election were coming to me like, what do I read? And they want to kind of like guidebooks and tips and that kind of thing. I was like, read history, read world history, become familiar with it, because it's going to seem very chaotic from here on in. It's going to seem like nothing you've ever seen before in America, but it has happened before. And you need to look at, the worst episodes in American history, at Jim Crow, at slavery, at internment camps, at all those things. And then also look at other countries and how these, incremental changes lead to something absolutely horrifying. And then you got to just, you got to clamp down and you got to fight it early.
What's the role for today's media in all of that?
I think it's to expose corruption. I think it's to tell the truth, even if that's uncomfortable. I think that there's this sort of both sidesism, this sort of horse race attitude. To me, there's nothing amusing about this. I mean, I'm cool with people laughing at Trump because he's... Yeah, there are laughable things. There are humorous, unfortunate things about him, but the situation itself is very serious and should not be treated as entertainment. And I think that, not letting up, not letting anything go, and making the connections between all these different controversies. Every day we're hit with a wave of scandals, and they seem like they're not related. They often are. And I think investigating the backgrounds of this set of characters that we're presented with is very important, because actually a lot of this stuff, especially related to Trump and mafia connections, criminal connections, Kremlin ties, was reported. There were reports all through the 80s, all through the 90s, even, while he was hosting The Apprentice, of his financial misdeeds, of his criminal ties. They are in the public domain. I feel like my epitaph is going to be it was in the public domain, because, sometimes people are like, how do you know this? How do you have all this secret info? I'm like, I don't. I went into the Village Voice archives from the 80s and read Wayne Barrett. I don't have an inside source. I'm just doing my research. I'm doing the stuff I did as a PhD student, only I'm doing it in journalism.
Ironically, he may save some newspapers, because publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, which I think most people would agree are doing a great job. And get this, okay.
Washington Post is doing a real good job.
They just won 2 Pulitzers.
They're doing a good job.
You don't think the Times is doing it?
I think they're a mixed bag. The Times still owes an explanation for why they had a headline saying that Trump had no connection with Russia. The Times should stop running soft-focused puff pieces about neo-Nazis that, bring out how human and likable they are. The Times has done some very irresponsible things. They've also done some great reporting, especially on environmental issues, on some other issues of the administration. So it's not like everyone at the Times is bad, but I have been disappointed in them, and I think it is important, to get that explanation about what they did with their Russia coverage.
Their subscriber base is also soaring all of a sudden as a result of all of this.
Yeah,
same with the Post.
They advertise themselves as, the free press is being attacked, which is absolutely accurate, and here is a way to support not just our particular paper, but the principle of the free press. And theoretically, I agree with that, but I think, with that power comes responsibility. I do think that the Washington Post has done a very good job. I think that the Times should be more responsible about what they choose to cover and how they choose to frame it. There's a difference between exploring a topic and glamorizing it, and I worry they fall on the latter half of that.
We're hearing a lot today about Stormy Daniels, needless to say. And we're also hearing that it's probably not going to be the Russia thing that's going to bring Trump down, if he's brought down. It's going to be Stormy Daniels. You agree?
It may be. I think the connection between the two is obviously Michael Cohen. I like Stormy Daniels, and I like her lawyer a lot. And
St. Louisan.
Yes, a St. Louisan. If he comes, if you're listening to this, I'll take you to Annie Gunn's. That's what I heard is his favorite place. But yeah, I think she's brave to come forward. I'm glad that she, the important thing about Stormy Daniels isn't the sexual relationship, it's the threats. It's the threats of violence, because that is a tactic that Trump's team of goons, his lawyer goon squad, has been using since time immemorial. From his days with Roy Cohn, who is a very important figure that is not explored enough, to what's going on with Michael Cohen. And so I think that she helped bring that up. I think that, together as a team, they helped lead Americans to a greater understanding of what this operation is about.
Roy Cohn, of course, who was an aide to Joseph McCarthy back in the 50s during that anti-communist era, and maintained his office in New York for many years and was a close associate and mentor in many ways to Donald Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump is a person who's had basically no friends. He has wives and he has lawyers. And Roy Cohn was the only person who you could really think of as, his friend. They called each other all the time. They were very, very close. Roy Cohn is one of the worst people probably in American history. He was not just Joe McCarthy's lawyer. He was a lawyer for the mafia. He was somebody who threatened, who bullied. He was a Jewish anti-Semite. He was a gay homophobe. People who, interviewed him regularly, like Wayne Barrett, thought he was lizard-like. He was Satan-like. He's never done anything good. And he taught Trump this strategy. He also mentored Roger Stone, who also embraced the strategy of attack, 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 lie, lie, lie. Nothing matters. And I always think to myself, if you're Donald Trump, you're born into wealth, you have everything you want, and you want a friend, why do you make Roy Cohn your friend? Of all the people in the world, like, who's friends with Roy Cohn? That's just weird, And Cohn groomed this whole little coterie of goons, Manafort, Stone, Atwater, And so the story of Trump really goes back to that mentorship with Cohn. I think if you read about Roy Cohn, who interestingly enough does not have a significant biographer because the biographer is always threatened with lawsuits, you will learn how Trump operates in the media economy, in the political world. You will learn quite a bit.
I kind of get the feeling that you don't think much of Roy Cohn. How would I get that idea?
Roy Cohn was extremely intelligent. Roy Cohn, was just amazingly, amazingly smart and used all his powers for evil. He never did anything good. He was upfront about it. He bragged about it. If Roy Cohn, down in hell is listening to this interview, he's thrilled. This is how he wanted to be remembered, So there you go. And I think that Trump was his creation. I think Trump was something moldable and malleable. And Cohn was Trump's entree into this world of mafiosos, of shady business deals. When Trump was taking advantage of New York's hard times, Trump always takes advantage of hard times. He loves collapse. He loves when things go wrong. Cohn was there to defend him and help him get what he wanted, and also to hook him up with a lot of very shady characters. And they boasted openly about that. The same flaunting that you see today was perfected in the 80s by Trump and Roy Cohn.
And yet I think a lot of people don't know that part of the history of Donald Trump, or going back to McCarthy even.
Yeah, and it's frustrating. Again, learn history. And that was one of the things I felt was really lacking in the 2016 coverage was, how did Trump get into this position of power? People really believed he was the guy from The Apprentice. His voter base believed that. But unfortunately, a lot of the media, I think especially younger people, knew him as that. And the idea that Trump was very corrupt, that he was in fact a terrible businessman. He kept going bankrupt over and over. And you got to kind of think, well, how did he stay afloat? Who financed him? Who brought him back to life? Those are all important questions to look at. They weren't looking at that. They were looking at Hillary Clinton's emails over and over for, 2 years on end.
Let's change the subject a little. We keep coming back to it seems, but change it once again, because you were an ardent observer of the Ferguson story when that was breaking, and since, too. What's your take on how far we've come since Ferguson, since August of 2014?
Unfortunately, I don't think we've come that far. I think we need, structural change. We need systemic change. I think we've come far in awareness. I think that, more people are aware of things like corrupt, racist traffic ticket schemes, that boost these municipal economies. They're more aware of how the economies are set up. But in terms of how black people are treated in St. Louis and St. Louis Metro, the same problems are there. I haven't heard of any improvement. You're still having people killed by the police. You still have, an unequal school system. You still have job discrimination. You have all of these things in play, and it's very frustrating. I'm glad that some citizens are standing up, but the other thing that's happened is I think Many people are just traumatized. They're exhausted. I know a lot of the Ferguson protesters, the ones that are actually from here and stayed here, and they have trouble finding jobs. They have trouble finding bills. And that all they wanted to do was stand up for their constitutional rights and to show support to Mike Brown and his family, and stand up against the idea that a policeman can kill an 18-year-old boy, leave the body on the street for 4 hours, and have nothing happen. That should not be something people are punished for. That should be applauded as citizens standing up for what's right. But unfortunately, that's not what happened.
We did a program recently on segregated housing in St. Louis, and basically using the Del Mar divide, as we often do, the jumping off place when we talk about racism. And in spite of the Fair Housing Act of 50 years ago, in spite of the Shelley versus Kramer Supreme Court decision on restrictive covenants, it's just exactly like it was back then. Nothing really has changed. People are really locked into low-quality housing in poor neighborhoods and can't get out.
Yeah, they can't. I've written about this before, about how the connection, there's a connection between economic deprivation and racial discrimination. People often try to treat this issue as, either or. You care about the economy or you care about, quote, social justice and race, but you cannot separate them. And I think, St. Louis is an incredible case study of that. And I think we need programs. We do need to raise the minimum wage, despite what the Missouri legislature thinks, in order to help people out of poverty. And we need to acknowledge that people are in poverty through no fault of their own often. They're born into it, and it's very difficult to work your way out of that situation. And that's something I describe in the book in great detail.
One of our guests on that program was Jason Purnell, who is the director of the For the Sake of All report. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I'm betting you might be. But one of the things they point out that in almost adjoining zip codes, the disparity in length of life is as much as 13 years between the more affluent zip code and the poor zip code. I mean, that's pretty stark.
Yeah, no, it's a travesty. And, I have an essay in that collection from 2013 where I talk about how, the life expectancy in North St. Louis, which is almost entirely black, is the same as, I think Iraq, maybe Yemen, as countries that have been through wars, as countries that, have incredible poverty. And then, yeah, as you say, you go a few zip codes away and you have something really, really different. And that's why, I get frustrated when I hear this blame of just, pull yourself up or, get yourself out of that situation. When you grow up like that, you're deprived of things like nutrition. You're deprived of things like healthcare. How are you supposed to defy all those odds? Like, why are you putting that incredible burden on children and mothers and families who are just struggling to get by and are in that situation just because they happen to be born black in North St. Louis?
And there doesn't seem to be a national mood to do much about it right now.
There's just apathy. I mean, not among everyone, there are people doing this. There are certainly, black folks out advocating for change. I often feel like those movements aren't covered. There's always this attitude of, why don't you take care of your people or whatever? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I see, activism all the time. I mean, it's white people who aren't doing anything. And so, yeah, I would hope that something would come of this. I sort of felt like we were starting to move toward that as a nation, towards this acknowledgement before the election came along. But then, unfortunately, under Trump, we've had all these new crises. We've had, like, are we going to have a nuclear war with North Korea? Or what's up with all the Nazis? Like, those are our new problems. And so, the serious structural problems of inequality and racism and all these, things we were coping with before get kind of swept underneath. But they shouldn't be, both because they help inform the current new crises and because they're crises unto themselves.
We had talked shortly before we went on the air, and I mentioned that sometimes I feel like I'm experiencing PTSD with the barrage of news that we're getting and the substance that we're getting. Do you think that's possible? Do you think the American public is just rocking on its heels because of all of this?
I mean, absolutely, because there's almost no one that this administration is hurting. There's the whiplash of the news and a lot of very terrifying stories, about war, the idea that our president is erratic, is, furious, is corrupt, is firing people. There's that. But there's also just, do you know anyone who's an immigrant? Do you know anyone who's not white? Do you know anyone who's a woman? Do you know anyone who's a teacher? Do you know anybody who's losing their health care? Like, odds are pretty good. Yeah, you do. And that includes the Trump Trump fans, the people who voted for him. They're also getting screwed over by Trump. And some of them, have expressed their displeasure. And I think others are keeping quiet out of this fear that somehow if Trump goes, then, along walks in Hillary or, some sort of awful Democratic travesty. But, the pain of this country is just greater, and the fear and, and the protest. And the protest aspect is good. But yeah, if God willing, I don't even know what to say about get out of this situation, because we're really going to be dealing with the repercussions of this for decades. But I think it's normal to feel anxious and to feel depressed and to feel upset. And if you feel those things, let yourself feel them, take a break. It's I work all the time. I talk about this stuff all the time. So people think I'm against taking a break. It's you gotta do something for yourself, or you're not gonna be able to get through.
Again, trying to turn away from politics just a little bit. As you were going through the book and getting it prepared for the print version that is out now, we mentioned earlier that many of the things you wrote about 4 or 5 years ago apply today. What struck you as you were going through it about the things that haven't changed that are really important to us?
It's always weird to reread your own work. I guess one of the strangest feelings I had, I wouldn't describe it exactly as nostalgia for these times, because I write about very depressing things, but this sort of sense that, we really have turned a historical corner. And I think we all knew that when Trump was inaugurated, things were going to be very different. And I think, if anything, this just shows you need to take care of these structural problems, these deep-seated issues, before they culminate into something like the election of Donald Trump. There are a couple essays in there that sort of stood out, like the one I wrote about paranoia and conspiracy theories as part of American life. I was like, wow, that really developed in a way that is just breathtakingly out of control now. And, that's something that I think, we need to explore in more detail.
One of the words that keeps popping up in my rereading of it is the word exploitation. You see that in many different arenas, don't you?
Yeah.
Young people, business, you name it, and people are being exploited.
Yeah, and it's very hard to avoid, and that's one of the reasons I focused on higher education to a certain degree, because that was always thought of as a path out of hardship, out of poverty, and out of, exploitation. If you achieve at a certain level, you get a good job, you get security, you get power. If there's a subject this book is about, it's really about power. I don't think anyone has that security anymore. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or a GED. Odds are you are working at a job that makes it difficult to pay your bills. And I say that because most PhDs are working in temporary positions, working as adjuncts. You have certain advantages, because in America they punish you if you don't get a college degree. They hold that against you on the job market, even if that college degree has absolutely nothing to do with the skills required to do your job. We didn't used to need a college degree for all these things. And against credentialism. I wish jobs would stop requiring them, because I think they're enormously expensive and unnecessary. And in that way, weirdly, I'm aligned with Donald Trump. That's the only thing that McDonald's. But yeah, that's something that continues to this day, and the more that people consolidate power and the less accountability we have, the worse it's going to get.
You talk about privilege as well, and tying that in with education. I remember a story, and I don't have the details quite right, but kids going to school at Harvard from very privileged families, and what the families are entitled to in order to get those kids into the school. Could you tell that story?
Yeah, something well over half, I think, of Harvard, the Harvard entering class I referenced, have families that make something over $200,000, often quite more than that, in the millions. And almost nobody with an income of below $45,000 gets in. That's a very small part. The median income is around, $52,000. And so we don't have a representative body entering Harvard. We have people like Jared Kushner, whose family, gave an enormous amount of money for him to get in. That's the kind of people we have going. But that prestige, that name brand is still held up as some kind of achievement. And I think it's really unmerited. And it kind of parallels the geographical inequality, where if you're, successful in New York, that means one thing. That means that it really matters. It's really important. You must have something smart to say. If you're doing the same kind of work in Missouri and you're staying there by choice, then, people are shocked that you have all your teeth. It's really a incredible double standard, and it's not beneficial to a healthy nation. We should look at what people do, what they contribute, how they treat others, and not how much money they have, where they went to school, all this nonsensical stuff, because it's no longer a reflection of merit.
And when some of those kids get out of school, they network with each other and they help each other. Well, the rest of us need help don't get it.
Yeah, it's very insulated. I've been close enough to it that I've been able to watch how it works, firsthand. I mean, there's a little of that going on at Wash U, where I went for my PhD, and it's dangerous. I think I have a line in the book, like, a false meritocracy breeds mediocrity, and we certainly see the effects of that in our political spheres, in our media. We're not getting the best. And when it comes to something like public servants, people deserve the best minds, the people, with the most compassion and intelligence and awareness of current affairs. And they're not getting that. They're getting Ivanka Trump, and so that's where we are.
I'm just looking for a quote here from one of your pieces, and it is this: "The poor, the unemployed are vilified for the things that they lack."
Yeah, absolutely. And that continues. I mean, that's something that has been going on for a long time. Like when, Lyndon B. Johnson launched the war on poverty, by the Reagan era, it was a war on the poor. It was, looking at poor people as if they're greedy, they're sucking off of the government, they're purposefully lazy, not looking at the reasons people get in the situation, not looking at how easy it is to fall in that situation. And I think that actually helped Trump, this idea, because his fans, who themselves were going through incredible hardship, I think had internalized that sense of shame, and they didn't want to feel that. They didn't want to feel like they had screwed up, that they had harmed their family. And in many cases they didn't. They got laid off from somewhere and it wasn't their fault. But I think when you feel shame about yourself, it can go two ways. You can become more compassionate for others, or it will come out as hate. You'll want to feel part of a group. You'll want to feel like you're getting back some power. And I think that Trump allowed people to feel like they were getting back that power by being part of his movement.
And I think it was Ronald Reagan who coined the term welfare queens.
Right, and which, is a caricature of a person who never existed. A lot of those stories, that came out in the 80s that, I grew up with as a kid, not really thinking they were true, but thinking this is normal political rhetoric. I didn't question it as something new until I was older and realized what a departure it was. Something like the way he talked about unions and what happened to unions in the 80s. Like, to me, a union was something my grandparents were in. We don't need them anymore. I really thought that was it when I was like a teenager. And then I was like, whoa, we have like an entire labor. I mean, my grandparents set me straight. But yeah, we have a whole history that's being destroyed, purposely destroyed. And I was glad to see unions kind of coming back into the picture around 2012, 2013. But, it's now kind of going the other way again. So they don't like that.
There's still only 10 or 12% of the workforce, where they used to be 3 times that, not too many years ago.
Right.
We are at Left Bank Books, and we're going to be taking questions from the audience. And we will begin with you, sir. What is your name?
My name is Tobea. I'm a federal insurance navigator here in St. Louis, helping people get enrolled in Marketplace and Medicare plans. I had a question for you about what you were talking about, the moral necessity of the work that you do. It makes me think about Hannah Arendt and the similar question she was asking during the Nazi rise to power. And I guess my question to you is, what scares you most right now with an eye to that banality of evil?
Wow, you don't want to know what scares me most. With the idea of the banality of evil, that it doesn't come at you immediately, that people will just stand by and let atrocities happen, that is something that does haunt me. I do think that people are not accepting this administration. Not everybody. People are worn out. People are tired. What I guess broadly scares me most is the impunity, the flaunting of crimes, and the lack of consequences, the lack of accountability, because we have people in our government committing crimes and confessing to them even in plain sight, and then you wait and wait for them to be indicted, for them to be removed from office, for something to happen to them, because, a regular citizen could do something, a fraction of what they do and end up in jail. And it's just not happening. And so you're left with the sense of like, well, who's really running the show here? Who's going to bring those charges? And that speaks to me of consolidation. And that's what I worry is happening. And I don't think it's too late. I think that we should keep fighting it. But I am concerned that this has continued for such a long time without consequences.
We have some more questions. Let's take them.
Hi, I'm Linda from University City, and thank you very much for your work. My concern, and I think Don spoke to it a little bit, is that here we are and we're all listening to you, but I kind of feel like you're preaching to the choir. I was listening to Sean Hannity on PBS NewsHour tonight, and Fox News doesn't seem to be interested in changing, and that really concerns me for the future of the United States. And what can we do as citizens when you've got this huge monolithic group on the right, that is so tied into the evangelical Christians? I mean, what can we do as people?
Right.
And
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think to some extent, there are people that are not going to be reached. They really don't want to be reached. They're unwilling to be confronted with a different narrative, with different facts. I think the most kind of important group of the 2016 election are the people who didn't vote, which is about half of the country, or people who are ambivalent, or people who are confused. I think we often see these extremes presented in the narrative. Everybody's like really hardcore for Trump, or they're really hardcore for the Democratic Party. I think most people are disillusioned and anxious, and they're somewhere in the middle. So there are things that, broadly as a society, we often can agree about. And I think you also shouldn't expect someone to agree with you about everything. I mean, that would be weird. That would actually be terrible. That would be a sign of an authoritarian state. So it's good to have healthy disagreement. It's good to have debate. And so try to find those points of commonality. Like sometimes when I've talked to people who vote for Trump or who are very conservative, we can often find a point of commonality, and then I'll try to kind of widen the debate from there to see if we can find another one, or if I can, sort of just at least show him how I see things. And you can see that my view is not unreasonable, even if it's a view that he still disagrees with.
Another question, please.
Hi, my name is Barbara. I'm from Webster Groves. I'm very concerned about the Russian influence in our government and the seriousness of the influence in the 2016 election. And I was wondering if you think some failure in the United States government's attitude or diplomacy with Russia in the recent past, but before Trump, contributed to this problem.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely did. It wasn't exactly a failure of diplomacy as a sort of sense of they can't really hurt us or this isn't serious. I think that, after Russia invaded Crimea, the U.S. should have been aware of what was going on. And I think in terms of the particular crisis involving Trump, one thing that really astonished me when I was covering the election, I can read Russian. I studied Russian for graduate school. So I started to look at what the Russian state media had to say about the election. And I was going all the way back to 2014. And over, they were building up Trump. They were saying he was a hero. They were saying he was going to bring glory to Russia. They were just out front, building him up for a Russian domestic audience. And I kept thinking, how did this get by the American media? Because this is weird. Like, this is the host of Celebrity Apprentice. He was not, a kind of somebody who they thought would be the president. So it implied to me that they knew something in advance. Other people, political scientists who study Russia, noticed this as well and thought, well, this is incredibly strange. And they thought, oh, maybe there's just a cultural similarity between Trump and some, colorful Russian politicians or oligarchs or whatnot. But it wasn't really that. It was, the beginning of a propaganda initiative. And it is very disappointing to me that the government didn't take it seriously. I think the Obama administration really blew it. And I think that they especially did during the transition period when they had an opportunity to kind of call this out. I just want people to know the truth. I want Americans to know the truth. And I think it's the obligation of presidents, of FBI heads, of everybody. It's not a partisan issue. I'm angry at both parties. I'm much more angry at the Republicans right now. But nonetheless, they had an obligation to tell us this. This is a danger to our national security. When a major threat like this happens, you got to just tell people, even if it sounds nuts, even if it sounds like a Tom Clancy novel, you still have to tell the people. So, yeah, they messed up.
We're going to have to wrap this up, but I have one more quote here that I just want you to respond to because it's too good not to mention. And you write that America is not red or blue, but purple, the color of a bruise.
Yeah, originally, that's an expansion of a line I used once in an essay about Missouri and an essay about the Midwest. But, I think it's true. There are these stereotypes of red states and blue states, whereas if you look at an actual map, of course you get a mix of people. Of course people have different ideologies, have different opinions, and that's healthy, that's good. But I do think that we have a shared sense of pain, of disillusionment, of anxiety, of disappointment, and I think that pain is easily exploited. I think that pain is visible, like a bruise. I think it's something people see in each other, and we don't know quite how to cope with it. It scares me that we have a government that preys on it instead of tries to remedy it. But I'm glad that we have a citizenry, that will stand up for other people in a large part.
Your crystal ball worked very well with the Trump election. What do you see in it right now for the future?
Oh, you don't want to know. There are some bad things that I think are coming that if they're not coming, I don't want to talk about it. But there's one thing I do want people to sort of be aware of. Everyone's kind of looking at the 2018 midterms. It's like, okay, this is our chance to, turn the tide a little bit. I do think that the prospect of a Democratic win or even a sweep is likely if, and that's not everything. There's other problems you have to fix. It's not just about voting. But anyway, we need to be looking at voter suppression. We need to be looking at voter ID laws. This happened in 2016 after the partial repeal of the VRA. We need to look at domestic suppression, and we need to look at, foreign intervention from Russia. And then we also need to look, unfortunately, at the way that those narratives can be useful for the GOP. Say there's a Democratic sweep. What if Trump then says, oh, actually, that was Russia. All those votes are illegitimate. It was totally Russia that did it, which makes no sense because the reason that Russia interfered with our elections is basically for sanctions for oligarchs in order to get that policy passed. So they would not intervene on the Democratic side. I can unfortunately envision a scenario where this happens. We need to protect the integrity of our elections. And I think the best way to do that is to make everything as transparent as possible, to have officials who are really documenting this hard, so we cannot have fakes all over the internet. We cannot have fake news. We cannot have false claims because they will try it. And it's grotesque, but I do think that it's going to happen, and it's something we should all keep an eye on.
Sarah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Author-journalist Sarah Kendzior talking about her book, The View from Flyover Country, recorded last week at Left Bank Books in the Central West End. Archive versions of past St. Louis On the Air programs are available for download or podcast at stlpublicradio.org/STL On Air. St. Louis On the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU. Thank you for listening. I'm Don Marsh.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.